Well, lest anyone was worried by the somewhat less friendly reception the Israeli Prime Minister received on his last trip to Washington, rest assured the family, as they call it, is tight. As always, the emphasis during the talks in the White House was on pushing forward. Direct talks, in this case, on the peace process. Meanwhile, the moratorium on settlement building is set to expire at the end of the summer, and that, if carried through, is likely to hamper negotiations. The president only talked hopes that peace negotiations would be underway before that moratorium expires. Why is Israel's #1 ally and military supplier talking about the audacity of hope again? Coming up, Norman Finkelstein, who will be joining us. First, this.
My hope is that once direct talks have begun, well before the moratorium has expired, that will create a climate in which everybody feels a greater investment in success. Not every action by one party or the other is taken as a reason for not engaging in talks. So there ends up being more room created by more trust.
The reports about the demise of the special U.S.-Israel relationship aren't just premature, they're just flat wrong. There's a depth and richness of this relationship that is expressed every day. Our teams talk. We don't make it public. The only thing that's public is that you can have differences on occasion in the best of families and the closest of families. That comes out public.
The best of families, the closest of families, and again, those hopes. Norman is the author of This Time We Went Too Far, about the Israeli invasion of Gaza. Welcome back to GRITtv. You actually had pretty tough talk coming from Dana Milbank today in the Washington Post, saying this was all talk, no action, and the president had waved a white flag to the Israeli prime minister.
Well, it was a pretty cynical move by President Obama. Most of the speculation is that it was due to the upcoming congressional elections and the need to get large amounts of money from rich Democratic Jewish donors. Had nothing really to do with the so-called peace process or with the what happened in the Mavi Marmara. It's totally.
Well, let's talk about the coverage for a second. The New York Times today, front page story, I got it in my hand, talks about while the press conference and meeting was laden with theatrics, it was nonetheless deeply substantive. What substance are they talking about?
Well, there's no evidence that there was any substance to the talks. We have to look at the facts. And not listen to the rhetoric. In any process, at a certain point, you judge a process by the facts, the reality, and not by the rhetoric, the results. So you take the case of the so-called peace process. Yesterday, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, it put out a new report on the settlement building in the occupied territories. And it made three basic facts, or documented three basic facts. Number one, the peace process is usually said to have begun in 1993 with the Oslo Accord. Between 1993 and today, the number of settlers has increased by 3 times. It was about 110,000 in 1993. The number of settlers in the West Bank is now 300,000. If you take all the settlements and settlers, it's increased, including East Jerusalem, which is also occupied Palestinian territory. It's increased about 2 times, so it's now about 500,000 settlers. Israel, in the course of since the occupation began in '67, Israel has annexed about 42% of the West Bank for settlements. Those are the results. That's the concrete reality. The rhetoric is simply designed to obfuscate the fact that it's not a peace process, it's a colonization process. And if you conceive what's happened since 1993 as a colonization process, then the results make perfect sense. If you conceive it as a peace process, well, obviously there's some kind of cognitive dissonance here, because there hasn't been any peace achieved. What's been achieved is Israel's annexation and appropriation of Palestinian land.
So is the discussion of whether the moratorium will be allowed to expire misguided in the sense that it doesn't sound like there's been much of a moratorium?
Well, there hasn't been a moratorium. First of all, you have to bear in mind East Jerusalem under international law, and there's no dispute about it, East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. Under the terms of the so-called moratorium, there was no moratorium in the East Jerusalem. Number two, the so-called settlement freeze allowed for the continuation of projects which had already begun. And number three, there were hundreds of projects which were illegally started, technically illegal under the moratorium, about which the government did nothing. And then if you leave all of that aside, you still have a basic fact. There are 500,000 settlers in the occupied territories, and there is no talk whatsoever about dismantling the settlements and Israel's full withdrawal to the June 1967 border, which is the basis of any kind of resolution of the conflict.
Two questions on this. There was an article also this week revealing that some evangelical Christian groups that claim a tax exemption in this country are sending people to help the settlements during the summer, different work shipments. In a sense, the federal government giving a tax credit, money, to people engaging in the very policy the White House claims to be calling to stop.
Well, there are two ways to look at it. Of course, it's useful to have that kind of news presented to the American people, that it's a front page story in the New York Times. But on the other hand, that really is a trivial aspect of the settlement enterprise. They were basically talking about the evangelicals who contribute to what are called the illegal outposts. They're not illegal, but that's a separate issue. But that's not a significant aspect of the settlement enterprise.
Do you think they should get a tax break?
The significant aspect of the settlement enterprise is the fact that the entire government of the State of Israel is involved in, as the B'Tselem report points out, the entire government of the State of Israel is involved in subsidizing the housing, giving tax breaks, creating the infrastructure of the settlements. And what the United States ought to be saying is there will be a withholding of any aid for the State of Israel until it stops its grave breach of the Geneva Convention.
So not just an issue of the subsidies to the non-profits, but the subsidies to Israel. Quickly, before we run out of time, Norman, I want you to address the question of the blockade, just before we run out of time. The New York Times, again, an editorial today, talks about the Israeli blockade of Gaza having been amended to allow most products except for military-related items.
This military-related items is a very expansive category because it includes, there are two categories. I don't want to get into the technicalities here. Let's just say there are severe restrictions on the entry of cement, steel, and everything that's necessary in order to rebuild Gaza after Israel's massive destruction in 2008, 2009. But there's another fundamental question which is constantly ignored. It's considered Israel's right to restrict the entry of what's called military-related items. But under international law, Israel should also be prevented from having military-related items come into Israel. Now, that's not rhetoric. Under international law, it's illegal, I should add, under international law and domestic American law, it's illegal to transfer weapons to a country which is a consistent violator of human rights. Now, Amnesty International has said in its report, Fueling Conflict, it said that Israel is a consistent violator of human rights, and therefore there has to be a comprehensive arms embargo, Amnesty said, not just on Hamas. There has to be a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel.
Norman, that's the last word. Thank you. We'll bring you back very soon. Norman Finkelstein's most recent book is This Time We Went Too Far. We'll link at our website, GRITtv.org.